So it's 12:01, and to set a good precedent, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're all set, Shirley and Paula, I believe. So welcome to the first CRC Roundtable, a monthly virtual seminar series intended to host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations, matching scientific advances and management needs in a way that moves us collectively forward toward decision-making for effective and sustainable management of the Bay, the watershed, and its living resources. Margaret Wheatley said, "Without reflection, we go blindly on our way, creating more unintended consequences and failing to achieve anything useful." This webinar series is intended to make the space for reflection so that that does not happen. And to that purpose, each seminar will invite a diverse range of researchers, managers, and other professionals to have conversations around critical topics in order to build connectivity between all of us and to increase our collective competency for decision making. These webinars are intended to focus on actionable steps versus education awareness around issues. And I think the pent-up demand for this type of conversation is evident in the number of registrants, over 120, for this webinar. And I believe that we're on to something. As a reflection of the intent to actionable steps, the panelists have been given about 10 minutes each to make some introductory remarks and answer some questions that we gave to them ahead of time, allowing 30 minutes for discussion. So I will ask one question of the panel to get that started, and then the majority of the time will be an open floor to all of you. And this is all about you, the attendees, giving you a place to ask the clumsy questions and growing us collectively in our ability to move forward. Full disclosure, this is the Shakedown Cruise, so let's collectively enter into the experiment. Let me just go over some ground rules, and that these are all supported or all intended to support our intent for a conversation. So please type in, again, your name and organization. While it would be much more fun to see who can briefly describe what they do and where they're from, this will have to suffice. Please stay muted with your camera off while the speakers are presenting. We love seeing pets and small family members, but we've all witnessed those distracting moments on Zoom when we're trying to speak. I'll tell you, my daughter-in-law recently experienced such a moment in an online vet school class of about 60 people. Mind you, they all own dogs, and so one of their pets initiated a group howling that took about 5 minutes to shut down, so we're trying to avoid that. While the speakers are presenting, use the chat feature to ask any questions. We are committed to giving everyone an opportunity to participate in the conversation. So if those questions are not answered during the following discussion, we will attempt to do that in a follow-up email with the collective answers. During the second half of the webinar, again, we will welcome discussion from all of you. Raise your hand feature if you would like to speak, or you can use the chat feature again, and the same thing will apply if you would, if your question somehow does not get asked or answered, we will follow up with you. So if you can go to the next slide, Shirley. Okay, so it wasn't hard to determine the topic for the first webinar. The COVID-19 pandemic has greatly impacted our lives and the way we do business, including the way research, monitoring, and management are conducted. And as we look into the not so distant future, difficult budget decisions may impact monitoring activities at the state and federal level, and by association, the management decisions they inform. We've invited these three panelists to provide three different perspectives around the importance of environmental monitoring and how wise decisions can be made around the importance of monitoring and about balancing monitoring activities with other priorities. And we're all about ensuring that management of the Chesapeake Bay continues to be informed by the best science available. In order to bend the discussion towards action, please keep this in mind as you listen. What are factors or ways that you might suggest to prioritize monitoring elements so that we can formulate a strategy for various funding conditions? So let's get started. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, John Kennedy.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. You'll be happy to know I don't have any PowerPoint slides. The first question we were asked to address is, what do we need monitoring to answer? And from my perspective, working for the Department of Environmental Quality in Virginia, since we are primarily a regulatory agency, first and foremost, the general question we need to answer to fulfill our mandates under both Federal Clean Water Act and state water control law is whether or not our surface waters throughout Virginia are meeting water quality standards, and if not, why? And then probably of particular interest to this audience is our comprehensive and long-standing Bay monitoring network. And the question there that we're answering is, what is the current status of water quality in the Chesapeake Bay, and how has water quality changed over time? Under an adaptive management strategy framed by the Bay TMDL and our watershed implementation plan that was submitted and approved last summer, or WIP, we use monitoring results to identify areas where water quality is improving, where it's improving faster or slower than other, for which parameters, especially dissolved oxygen and clarity as examples. And we're asking whether or not we're on track to meet our WIP requirements and the current BMPs, using the current BMPs. And I think that the factor there that is very important to remember is, while the TMDL is based on inputs of nutrient and sediment loadings, the test for attainment and meeting our goals is whether or not we meet the water quality criteria and standards. So that only comes from our monitoring program. Where should we implement additional controls to get the best results for the dollars invested? And another recent issue that we're trying to address, it is addressed in our WIP and influencing our water quality control program statewide, is how might climate change impact our progress? The second question that we were asked to address, what do you anticipate the impacts of current issues, example, COVID-19, meeting 2025 targets, environmental justice, to be both short and long term? In the short term, we have COVID protocols now that are being utilized by our monitoring staff across the state. And that includes all the obvious things such as wearing masks in public spaces, social distancing, one person per car during transport and travel. This has all impacted our ability to monitor, particularly on long boat runs, which are part and parcel of our Bay monitoring program. Those boat runs may be especially difficult this winter, when the field specialists are going to have to seek cover in small spaces on boats, and they can't be as socially distanced as they might want to be. The COVID has increased the cost of our monitoring. We have to purchase PPE, increase fuel costs, equipment needs, time on the water is longer. And due to overall COVID impacts on the overall state budget, hiring has been frozen, and we have several key positions, including our QA/QC coordinator and regional monitoring staff positions that remain unfilled. On the long term, the impacts to the state budgets across the entire watershed, we're sure, are going to cause uneven rates of progress in implementation and the ability to implement our controls, which may impede our ability to improve bay conditions in the allotted time frame. The need to offset climate change impacts further stresses our capabilities, and the planning horizon is expected to be expanded beyond 2025. I know that they're already looking at climate change impacts for the timeframes of 2035 out to 2050. And as we know, in the times of the TMDL, nutrient removal is forever. Third, what decision-making processes are in place to mitigate these potential impacts on monitoring programs? So our agency and our partner agencies have procedures in place to keep the field specialists monitoring as safely as possible while avoiding risks of exposure to COVID. We began implementing new safety protocols and we resumed our activities on May 4th. So between the period of March 12th, when the governor announced a state of emergency, we were able to get back fully into our monitoring and into the field work by early May. We're currently reviewing and revising our monitoring protocols and addressing those as may be needed to conform. There's a new emergency temporary standard addressing occupational exposure to the COVID virus. And that was adopted in July by the Virginia Safety and Health Codes Board. We think we're in pretty good stead with those new requirements, but we're going to make sure that we're covering all our bases there. Any new requirements that we have to address will take effect on September 25th, 2020. Regarding climate change impacts, as I mentioned earlier, our watershed implementation plan already includes control measures that, when fully implemented, will offset the projected increases in total nitrogen and total phosphorus loads and allow the Commonwealth to meet its nutrient reduction commitments by 2025, under the big assumption there, though, that implementation rates aren't delayed. And finally, potential impacts will necessitate a closer look at monitoring programs. How do you envision the monitoring programs to look in 2025? As everyone across the watershed who's involved in monitoring knows, increased funding will be needed to maintain even the current level of monitoring. And that's due to the reality. One thing is, in the Bay program, there's a Chesapeake Bay implementation grant that goes to the member jurisdictions. And the allocation formula for the distribution of that funding has been changed. Used to be generally a 30-30-30-10 split between Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and the district. And now it's been unbalanced more to have more of the funding go into the most effective basins and those that need to do the most in order to achieve the Bay TMDL. So as a result, we're facing some known cost increases in the face of potentially lower federal grants. We also are facing, we have increases for staff raises as indirect costs. So level funding doesn't even keep pace with the cost increases. Funding will also be needed if we have to add any equipment, such as continuous monitoring units, if that's something that we want to shift to. And any major capital costs for replacement or repair of big ticket items like boats, motors, and trailers. A restructuring of the program may be needed to provide additional data to adequately assess progress. And for example, we have data needs and assessment methods to evaluate compliance with the short duration dissolved oxygen criteria that we currently can't assess. And in order to fully delist the Bay, we have to be able to say that we're meeting all the criteria. That's all I had to answer the 4 questions that I was given.
Thank you, John. And we will move right on to Lee. Lee, you're muted.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to participate today. Unlike John, I have a total of 2 slides and won't spend a lot of time on them. But in terms of in the Chesapeake Bay Program Office and what we do to support the partnership, what questions do we need monitoring to answer? And I think really the same vital question that John was looking to answer, and that is, are we meeting our water quality standards in tidal waters? The graphic on the screen is just one representation of our tidal monitoring network, just to give you an idea, spatial extent of data collection that goes on for our evaluations. And primarily, or one of the functions here is to take a look at dissolved oxygen standards throughout the tidal waters. And at the same time, you can pop up the next slide, please. This is a picture of the Bay non-tidal monitoring network. So these are stations that are located further up in the watershed. And primarily, these are telling us how are we doing with our current efforts? What trends are present in these monitoring stations? Are we making improvements? Are we seeing areas of degradation? And what can this data tell us in terms of targeting management actions and future activities? And all these data combined, all the monitoring data, it'd be great if we could have a more extensive monitoring network, but right now we're pretty stretched on what budgets allow. So we have a number of water quality models we use to simulate what we know in the watershed and how we can simulate management actions. And all this water quality monitoring data feeds those models or guides us and directs us toward having better tools to refine our management actions and what we'll do in order to attain water quality standards. So those two things go hand in hand. A lot of times there's questions about why don't the models and the monitoring data match? And there's a lot of answers for that, but the models are set up for certain activities to assess progress, but really to be used as management tools to determine where we focus our efforts and what BMPs, what management practices we can put in place. And the monitoring data tells us how well we're doing at that. And they're not necessarily synced in time, but both these things inform and help us document our progress. In terms of what do we anticipate to be current issues, COVID-19 meeting our 2025 targets. I don't know that we understand all the impacts of COVID-19 yet. And as John mentioned, we saw some brief interruptions in data collection. There were also some interruptions in lab services. So there wasn't if samples couldn't be analyzed, there wasn't a point in taking them. There was also a need to go back and assess safety protocols. So things have changed, and John covered some of that. Really the behavioral change in how teams operate, making sure people stay safe, PPE requirements, making sure that we're protecting staff. And I think all those things are going fairly well now. It was a little bit of a rocky start. And in terms of meeting 2025 targets, some of the things that, again, John has mentioned, we've had relatively flat funding in the monitoring program. And for, I think, all of you that work in government, flat funding means you're really kind of almost on a declining budget because the cost of, I'll say, services increases, the cost of pensions raises, equipment, all those things seem to go up, and flat funding won't maintain that. So not all to despair on that. And some of the things that maybe will change through time, we may use more citizen-based monitoring. There's some really good activities going on out there now. May be able to use some more of that in the future. We have new technologies that are being evaluated. So maybe we have things that are more cost-effective than we've done before. New analysis and how we interpolate the data that we have. So constant evaluation of new analysis techniques, and some of those are being used now, some of those are being proposed. So it may lead us to a better, more thorough assessment using some of the data that we already collect now. Hopefully we'll have increased accessibility to satellite imagery. That's being looked at, especially with looking at submerged aquatic vegetation or SAV. And we have some exciting new tools people are trying to employ, machine learning algorithms, being able to assess high resolution satellite imagery. So these are all things that will be potential cost savings and trying to do more with what we have or make more out of the information we have available to us now. And move on to the next question. What decision-making processes are in place to mitigate these potential impacts on monitoring programs? For all of you that are familiar with the Chesapeake Bay program, the partnership, all these activities. There are multiple goal teams and work groups that are constantly discussing the networks, their inputs, how we may better utilize that information. We've gotten really good input in past years from STAC. The STAC workshops provide a great forum for peer review and recommendations to the Bay program. We have, as I mentioned, a lot of work groups. The Criteria Assessment Protocol work group is constantly looking at ways that we could better use the data that we have to make assessments for water quality standards. And I'll say most recently, and this is now coming on 11 years, the management board of the Bay program was responsible for that last forum. And it was called the Monitoring Response Action Team. And in 2009, there was a holistic look at where resources should be deployed and what were our most important priorities. And very important that changed a lot of locations, added stations to the monitoring network. And as time goes on, it was recommended and a process should be undertaken to revisit some of that, maybe not redo all that work. It was a tremendous body of work that was done by that group back in 2008, 2009. But certainly to go back and reevaluate what we have in terms of our total monitoring network. And I'll make a mention of this too, Climate Resiliency Work Group and the Fish Habitat Work Group are working to prioritize monitoring elements that will let us make a better evaluation of living resources. So not as much a focus purely on water quality data, but how is that affecting the living resources? And can we do a better job looking at what those living resources need in terms of how we establish our monitoring network, or if we make changes there. And I'll move on to the last question was, potential impacts will necessitate a closer look at monitoring programs, and how do you envision the monitoring programs to look in 2025? So there's been recently been a more interest in the non-tidal network and looking at effects of local BMPs. People really want to get a feedback mechanism on the management actions they've taken, and are they really making a positive impact? And at some stations, it's easier to see that than others. It depends what that spatial resolution is. There's been more of a focus recently, and this is not necessarily part of the Bay monitoring network, but individual jurisdictions taking on and using more continuous data monitoring processes, so putting out data sondes. A lot more information can be gathered in a shorter time, and hopefully, again, provide that feedback mechanism to allow people know if the management actions they're taking are having that positive impact. In terms of the non-tidal network, we probably see generally the same density of what we have today. And I guess to go along with that, I mentioned earlier, there's some pilot studies going on using vertical profiling of water quality for vertical dissolved oxygen profiling, and trying to tie that together with some of the modeling data that we have to make additional projections for the tidal areas. And again, things coming out of our criteria assessment protocol work group really focused on how do we make better use of that data. And I'm trying to look just to see if I have any more points to cover on here. I think that I'll stop there, and that's the response for the questions posed. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. That was a really comprehensive look. I appreciate it. And we'll finish up with Matt.
Okay, so I'm happy to be asked to participate in the panel. And I guess I will try to sort of do this in the context of both of my hats, one in my day job, excuse me, at Stroud Water Research Center, working on some of these issues from both an academic standpoint as well as sort of providing technical assistance and advice to citizen monitoring efforts, and then also as the my role at the Chesapeake Bay Citizens Advisory Committee. Next slide, please. So I think the monitoring program is really critical to the public understanding of this investment we're making and the justification for that investment. And I think it's important to sort of remember why. Most of the general public and many sort of core stakeholders are, so they view the model with skepticism. And while many of us understand sort of how the model works and why it's important, it's easy to understand why it, excuse me, is a little esoteric to the general public. But the monitoring information, it engenders a completely different response. And they view that as real information. When we're out, whether it's in a citizen science context or sort of our Stroud team, when we have data from an individual's township or local stream or their farm, there's a very different conversation, and they are incredibly interested. The number of conversations we have with folks about what their stream looks like and what they're doing and how that might affect it and how that compares to their neighbor's stream or someone else's stream, it's just a very different conversation than we have when we talk about modeling. And I think that's really important from a stakeholder perspective. It's also, I think the folks out there who do understand the models that we use also then understand how important the monitoring is for calibrating and validating those models. And I think that's something we shouldn't lose, particularly in this time when people are questioning, well, what are the climate changes we're seeing? What impact are they having on our streams and on our activities? So to lose data that speaks to increasing storm intensity or other issues like that, I think would be a huge mistake, and I think people would recognize that. I think one of the questions we discussed was, so what pieces of this are really important from a citizen perspective? And I think it's sort of twofold. One is obviously we need to understand the changes in the impaired segments of the bay and how that feeds back into the TMDL. But I think from an engagement standpoint, people care about the local streams. So that local monitoring network is critically important to the work we do. Next slide, please. So when we were talking about this panel, Denise asked a question that I thought was really important. From a monitoring perspective, what keeps you up at night? And I guess it says something about us as individuals that doesn't sound like a strange question at all. Probably says more about me that I had an answer almost immediately. The disconnect between monitoring for the Chesapeake Bay and monitoring for local stream health and water quality worries me a great deal, as does the disconnect between achieving those two outcomes. And I think when we began to understand that people up in the watershed placed a different emphasis and value on their local waters than the more distant Chesapeake Bay itself, we started to change the language we used. And we started to talk about how, solving the bay problems is the same as solving our local watershed problems. And that's not without a significant amount of truth, but I think there are some really important distinctions that we've glossed over that I hope don't bite us in the long run. Next slide, please. When we work with local groups, citizen science groups, Trout Unlimited chapters, watershed associations, to think about monitoring, you know, we start at these questions about goals and how they intend to achieve them, and then get to the question of, well, so how do you monitor for that? What metrics do you use? What measurements do you take? What resolution of data do you need to know to understand the impact you're having? Next slide, please. And when we think about this, you know, from a Chesapeake Bay standpoint, the focus on nitrogen is critically important. The focus on nitrogen from a local stream standpoint, much less so. I mean, most of our freshwater systems, nitrogen's having a negligible impact on impairment issues. But we talk a lot about issues locally, like flooding and runoff. Can these streams be restored to a level of holding and providing reproducing wild trout? How do we get our local streams off the impaired streams list? And there are many ways where these issues conveniently overlap. Many of the best management practices we implement address numerous things, and there are a lot of co-benefits. But it is interesting to think through, you know, if we are pursuing strategies or recipes of implementation that focus, just for example, and I'm not, I don't want to disparage any BMPs, but a practice like manure injection, which really has a significant impact on nitrogen, which may not, depending on the situation, have much impact on our local stream, versus soil health practices that dramatically improve infiltration, or forest buffers, which can provide shade. We have sort of a dichotomy of outcomes from co-benefits there. Next slide, please. So I think it's really important to remember that we, you know, even our local water quality models tend to be focused around nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, but we measure our impairment with the biological system predominantly. So we have to think about the other issues of importance for these ecosystems: temperature, habitat, hydrology. I think the impact of winter salt loads from road salts sort of rising up there, the cocktail of chemistry that we have from our urban and suburban areas hitting our streams that we really don't fully understand. I think my concern is that we get to a place where we're making significant improvement in the bay loadings, and people start to ask the questions, well, why aren't our streams improved? And I think this links back to the discussion about the limitations in COVID. This is an area where we're perhaps not doing enough right now, and those resources are even more scarce now. I would offer that perhaps it provides an opportunity to think about how we engage a broader citizen science monitoring effort in ways that can help us link these two issues. So I'm really interested in getting to the questions. I'll stop there, and thanks for including me.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to all three panelists. You just gave wonderfully different perspectives on the issue of environmental monitoring and the questions you need answered. Let me just start off the discussion with a brief question to each of you, and then I'll open the floor. Again, to the attendees, you can use the raise your hand function, and you can start anytime. But the question I just wanted to put to you, and I think, Lee, you answered it in part, but you each gave us a different perspective on what questions you need monitoring to answer. And Matt, I especially appreciate the perspective from the stakeholders, from the citizen stakeholders. Do you, given that there may be, let's put it that way, budgetary implications, from the perspective of each one of your constituencies, do you have a way to prioritize the value of individual monitoring elements according to the questions that you needed to answer? So do you have a process? If somebody asked you, give me a priority list from your perspective, do you have a way to do that? And let me just ask that perhaps each one of you can just take a minute or two and give an answer to that question. And we can start with John and then go to Lee and then to Matt.
Yeah, I've given this a little bit of thought since the beginning of the seminar here. And as I indicated, you know, one of the basic questions we're trying to answer from a regulatory standpoint is whether or not we have impaired water bodies. So I think the prioritization of our monitoring programs is probably keyed an awful lot to, do we have a water quality standard or criterion that this monitoring program supports, gives us answers about. And I think a good example is the SAV monitoring. It is one of our biocriteria. We have acreage restoration goals that are actually embodied in our water quality standards. And part of that as well, or an ancillary to that, is water clarity, because you can have the water clarity conditions, but not the grasses, and still declare an area unimpaired. You have the conditions that should facilitate growth. Maybe you don't have the propagules in the area to do that, but that's an example of something that we would prioritize because it has a direct connection to a criterion or a standard. Another example I would give you of something that in the past we had to drop because of cost concerns: zooplankton monitoring. That's part of the food web, but we don't have a standard related to it. It's good information to have from a scientific standpoint, but unfortunately it was something that I guess was decided to be a nicety versus a necessity. I think one other factor that we would use in prioritization is, do you have a funding source for the data that you're collecting? And is that funding source fairly stable? And you know, a good example of that is the dissolved oxygen monitoring that we do in our water quality monitoring runs. That's standard field parameter that we're going to do everywhere because it's so important in terms of the Bay TMDL. So I think those are the two major factors that come to my mind when we do a prioritization. Unfortunately, there's advocacy for just about everything, and you'll find a pet need or a want for ions or biological macroinvertebrate monitoring or something like that. And while it's all important, I think it basically will come down to where do we put our money for analyses? Because I think it was mentioned earlier by one other speaker, far and away, other than staff salaries, our biggest budget is in the monitoring program is analytical services. So, you know, if you have a catalog of services and the price of something goes up radically, you may make a judgment call as to whether or not you're going to continue to do that in perhaps the volume or the number of samples that you're doing because the costs are getting too high. So those are the factors I think that we would use.
Oh, thanks, John. Lee, want to take a moment or two?
Yes, thank you. So in terms of prioritization, EPA through the partnership provides monitoring money or monitoring dollars to each jurisdiction, and that's you know, we'd love to see that portion of the budget go up, but as I mentioned, it's kind of flat funding right now between water quality and SAV. I think we're at about $5.5 million per year, and with that comes jurisdictional match to go along with the money provided through the Bay Program Office through federal funds. And any kind of prioritization, we'd be sitting down with the jurisdiction to evaluate that. And this could be, you know, in the case of those jurisdictions that have both tidal and non-tidal pieces of the network, not necessarily prioritizing one versus the other, but what do we get the most out of for those particular stations, and how many questions can they answer locally as well as for the overall health of the Bay. So it's not a I shouldn't say we don't have a plan scoped out or step-by-step process of already laid out of how those decisions will be made, but it would be in conjunction with the jurisdictions and great deal of thought given to what information or how big a bang we get for each of those pieces of information that we collect. So, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Lee. Matt?
Yeah, so from a CAC perspective, we have a very, very diverse group with a lot of perspectives, and I think it speaks to what John mentioned. There will be advocates for everything. I think from a 2025 perspective, a clear understanding of the progress we're making on the impaired segments that lead back to the TMDLs is critical and would top our list. And I think from there, while what's local to everyone looks a little different, I would say that the upstream monitoring stations that speak to the health of our local rivers and streams, as well as Chesapeake Bay, are things that people care deeply about and are great tools in terms of messaging the work that needs to be done.
Great. Okay, Laura, you have the floor.
Laura Fowler here with Penn State, and raising a question that we actually discussed at STAC, the Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee meeting last week, which is certainly we've been suffering through the coronavirus right now, and it's devastation in a lot of different ways, but it also opens up opportunities for novel insights, right? When you fundamentally change a whole bunch of the system all at the same time in a way that we wouldn't have set out to do an experiment. And I guess I'd raise the question to the three panelists, and that's the question we started to wrestle with at STAC, is what novel insights can you see? And are you seeing it show up in the monitoring data? For example, people wholesale stopped driving as much. Do we see a decrease in atmospheric deposition in the rivers and watersheds? Are there other novel insights like that that we should be looking for, or that you have already started to see, or that we could start to ask about? Thanks.
I'll take a crack at it. One that has intrigued me, to be quite honest, it was a water monitoring staffer in our group who proposed something during a chat that we were having during a catch-up meeting, the use of wastewater treatment effluent monitoring to try and determine where you might have large outbreaks. And at first, I didn't really think that much about the proposal. But evidently it's taking hold quite a bit, and they're finding a lot of utility evidently in using that monitoring information to try and identify areas where there may be outbreaks. So that's one example, a real world example, I guess, that I was thinking of. As far as driving less, we actually have found that our monitoring crews probably have to drive more because we have to put more cars out there. We have to get fewer people in the vehicles, and the shuttles are longer. You can't leave a car out there during a boat run down the Rappahannock River. You've got to have that car moving as much as the boat does. So to that extent, at least, our operation costs have either gone up or, we haven't seen the benefit of less driving in that regard.
Any of the other panelists?
I'll just say, I think those things, it usually takes us a little while to evaluate the data we're collecting. I'll say historically for overall trend data in the network, we're maybe a year, almost 2 years behind of the actual sample collection. So some of the things, Laura, that you had brought up, I think we'll be able to evaluate. Very interested to see if we had an impact on air deposition. But I don't know that we'll know the answer to that in the short term. And depending on what the future looks like, we may be back to a more typical social environment where our behaviors back to what it was by the time we have that data to evaluate.
Yeah, I guess I think it's a great question. Most of my work is in the ag realm, so we haven't seen a lot of, a lot of differentiation there. But I think John's comments about when you look at the work Hampton Roads Authority has done looking at COVID and wastewater and what that might mean to tracking other public health issues, other things like the flu or other things in through wastewater and the links to public health. It's sort of an interesting topic.
Okay, let me, I don't see any more hands raised. Let me, there are numerous questions in the chat box, so let me read this first one. It's from Eric Schott. Urban estuaries are highly modified, highly impacted, and are constrained by needs for shoreline stabilization, navigation, public safety, etc. By many measures, these waters fail standards, yet they have ecological functions as well as other societal value. I'd say that these waters need more monitoring and new ways of thinking about assessing targets for their, quote, health. Do the panelists have thoughts about where urban estuaries fit into the overall Bay goals and how to increase or adapt monitoring in these waters?
I don't know if John's getting ready to talk, but I'll start since you hesitated. One of the things that's going on very actively now, we have a couple projects looking at what we're calling ecosystem services. So how does the water quality in a given area affect other societal aspects, and what do people get out of that? So there's a number of projects going on in relationship to that. And hopefully there'll be, I'll say within the next year or two, some information to report out on that, meaning what societal benefits are we seeing by a cleaner embayment, a cleaner estuary, something happening locally. So a very good question, and one we're hoping to at least answer in part.
I would say from Virginia's perspective, we don't have a sort of a targeted monitoring program that looks just at urbanized embayment areas. We do try to characterize in general the water quality across the entire Commonwealth. But I would say in relation to things like a couple of instances where we have combined sewers, we are doing work in relation to bacteria monitoring, and we now have modified criteria for bacteria that we're trying to implement now with some increased monitoring, more frequent monitoring. I know in terms of shoreline stabilization, in Virginia, we have the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act that applies basically east of I-95. So in those areas where we have resource management areas and resource protection areas identified, there may also be a component of heavily urbanized or industrialized areas that are sort of excluded from that coverage. But that doesn't mean that we still don't want to comply with the water quality standards in the areas where that is occurring. So I can't really directly answer the question in terms of a monitoring program that's targeted specifically at those areas. They just get captured either as part of our ambient network. We do have some probabilistic monitoring where we'll randomly select stations across the state. They may fall into that category if they are randomly selected in that way.
Let me, there was a follow-up and it's associated question from Ann Swanson about that, and it's not so much spatial as it is sort of the issue of co-benefits. So Ann asked, several of you mentioned the importance of monitoring for multiple parameters getting at the issue of co-benefits, which I think was within that urban watershed question. As budget reductions are threatened, how do we get at this issue? Is there some kind of economy of scale approach that we should be advocating for that that could combine funding from multiple state or federal sources. And I kind of throw out that other question because I think, Matt, you actually were talking a lot about co-benefits and how that would be helpful in some sort of monitoring strategy.
Yeah, I think there's opportunities there. They're not without cost, whether that's for equipment or training, but a lot of the more sophisticated components of the citizen science monitoring effort would be capable of adding value. I mean, I think about, you know, we have some groups who are out there monitoring strings of hobo temperature sensors so that we, in addition to having some idea of load reductions, we could have, you know, a sense of where stream temperatures and particularly summer temperatures are improving, which would speak to aquatic life issues more specifically, perhaps. So I think this would take some thought, but I think there's opportunities to engage additional people and sources of data in ways that still have a reasonable level of quality control to assist in the effort.
Thanks. There is a great question here that I'm sure is going to be interesting. And the thread got started off by James Martin. Do you see a future where the Bay Partnership makes this shift from modeling as the means to measure and guide our progress to using monitoring instead? If so, when and what are the first steps in such a transition?
Well, since he's one of my staffers, I'll lead off. I think that the two have gone hand in hand pretty much thus far. You know, we're definitely doing our assessments, providing the integrated reports every 2 years. There's the annual progress runs that are made by the Bay program in terms of modeling. And that tells us how we're doing on the load reductions, but it doesn't tell us what the response is in the water. So the monitoring is really answering that question. The TMDL is based on load reductions, though. It states that we're going to meet the criteria as a result of that, but the currency of the TMDL is loadings. So I don't think we'll ever really be able to get away fully from the modeling and the use of the watershed model that the Bay program has developed in order to estimate what the loading reductions are that we've achieved through the best management practices and the wastewater controls that are put in. But I think that ultimately the focus will be on, you know, say after 2025, when we're supposed to have put all the controls in place, are we seeing the response in the water quality that was intended by putting that control in? And I think that there's going to be a lot more dependency on the assessments. Matt made a good point, I think. No, I'm sorry, it was Lee, that we don't have real-time monitoring. In our case, our integrated report that comes out every 2 years is based on a data window that closed 2 years earlier. So the Bay report cards and some of the monitoring assessments that are done by the non-governmental organizations where they give, say, a report card value for water quality in a given year. Those are more like almost a real-time kind of a processing of that data. It gives us some insight, but it's not the legal way that we do our assessments and declarations of impairments or delistings. But I think that people will look more towards the monitoring program to give us the answers as to whether or not we're meeting the TMDL.
The temporal challenges with load delivery and lag time as BMPs take effect, as well as just the variability of annual weather events are going to mean that we need to keep modeling, you know, in the forefront of decision making. But I agree with John that, you know, as we get further down the road, the monitoring becomes a bigger and bigger part of the validation of the work.
And I'll add in that the ultimate measure of whether or not we meet water quality standards is going to come from monitoring data, you know, not the model. And as we move along, and I agree, you know, once we get past 2025, I think it'll be more important to look at, say, those non-tidal network stations and look at the trends to see, are we truly going up or down? Are we seeing all the results that we expected to get based on that modeling analysis? And just draw a distinction, when we talk about the model, we're usually referring to the watershed model. So what's coming into the bay? I think the possibilities for more of the estuary model use may grow based on some different things we do with the monitoring data that we have, and maybe we can make more use of it through the estuary model. So I wouldn't just, when we say model in general, I think they're going to be a very big part of what we do in the future, but maybe a little different aspect, or used a little differently.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one last question, and I think it's pretty specific, and maybe you can just give a short answer. We're have about 3 minutes left. I want to make sure we finish on time. Clean Streams LLC, Alexi asked, microplastics, what initiative to monitor is the Bay program or Virginia engaging in?
Well, in Virginia, we actually have an academic advisory committee. It's composed of faculty from around the Commonwealth, several institutions, and we had them develop a white paper report last year, emerging contaminants in the Commonwealth. And one of the things that was included in that analysis was the emergence of microplastics. We don't have any designs right now or ideas of adding any monitoring programs specific to that, but it is on our radar screen, along with pharmaceuticals and all those other things that in many cases we don't have water quality standards for. But you know, this the whole arena of emerging contaminants is something that definitely we're going to have to keep in the forefront going forward.
Lee or
And
Matt,
that report is available through the DEQ website if they wanted to see that.
Okay, John, I think we'll put a link to that too
Okay.
on the website with the recording. Lee or Matt, any last words about that?
I probably won't do this justice for what's going on, but we do have a pollution plastics action team. So there's a lot of activity going on right now. Some of that's focused in the DC area, but somebody wants to shoot me an email on that, I'd be happy to follow up with a more complete answer.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just, CAC has certainly been thinking about this issue, the pervasiveness and the concerns. I don't know that we have any recommendations on monitoring, but recognize that it's something to think about.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, you all were so good. It is 12:59. Shirley, if you want to put up that last slide. My gratitude to all of the attendees and especially to the panelists. Just to let you know, please, we're initiating this. This is an important effort for us, and so let us know how it's going and how to improve by taking the post-event survey. And Wednesday, October 21st, our next CRC Roundtable is on the topic of how to move the needle on DEIJ goals. So again, my thanks to all of you for participation. We will follow up with an email on answers to the questions that didn't get addressed during the webinar, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.